There's a mistake. Moonlight, you guys won Best Picture.
You like me right now. You like me.
Ever since I was a little kid, I wanted this.
Mom, I just want an Oscar.
I'm Connor Wold, and welcome back to another episode of the Ultimate Oscar Showdown. And here we are on the last episode of our Best Picture ranking. We started off in the 2010s, now we're here into the 1940s. Next week we're going to be going back to the 2010s, but this time ranking the Best Actor winners. So the best lead male actor winners from the 2010s, then we're going to go to the 2000s all the way to the 70s, and then once again back up to the 2010s, but that time will be best actress, and then eventually best supporting actor and best supporting actress, and then we'll be back with the old Oscar countdown in the fall. You guys have been showing a lot of support for this series, liking the video, giving your comments down below, your own ranking. I love to see that stuff. That's why I make these videos, to hear your guys' thoughts and rankings, so please do keep that up. But without further ado, you guys know how this works. We rank the Best Picture winners from this decade, from S tier all the way to D tier. And without further ado, let's get started with the 1940 winner, Rebecca, which is Hitchcock's only Best Picture winner, even though Hitchcock himself has never won a Oscar, a competitive Oscar, that is. And it's crazy to think that this is his Best Picture winner, because it's probably not in his top 5 most celebrated movies, maybe not even in his top 10 most celebrated movies. And personally, to me, it's not in my top 10 movies. That being said, it's still a really well-made movie, really inventing the gothic romance genre from the sort of novels that were being written at this time, but really in the film landscape, I think Hitchcock really helped visually at least define this. As you can see, this link from this movie up until the remake of Rebecca, but also movie like 2015's Crimson Peak, the influence is clear. And that's my favorite part of the story, that doomed romance, that black and white imagery, the haunting nature of the movie. There's always something up and strange and not necessarily right within the movie, and that sort of tension really allows to drive the story forward in a smart and effective way. Now, personally, I wasn't totally able to emotionally resonate with the film, just because I don't have a lot of similarities between myself and the repressed 1940s women, which I think the movie really appeals towards. So personally, I just wasn't able to emotionally connect with it. That being said, it's still undeniably a well-made, well-crafted story, even if it has limited appeal to me. It's going to go into the B tier. 1941, How Green Was My Valley, which is notably the Best Picture winner that beat out Citizen Kane. And I think even the most hardcore John Ford fans, like myself, who I'm a big fan of, I think even they would be able to admit that Citizen Kane probably should have won. And I think because of that, like Ordinary People or Kramer vs. Kramer, or The King's Speech, it's one of these movies that we, as Oscar fans, sort of look down upon because, what? It can't be like Citizen Kane. I like Citizen Kane, therefore I don't like this movie. And it has a harsh reputation because of that, but mostly undeserving. Still John Ford. The reason why you watch this movie and it is worth the price of admission alone is the photography. I mean, this is maybe John Ford's best looking movie, which is something to say, just because no one frames images like John Ford. In the subtle camera movements that he does, but most of the time just the sort of static locked off frames, you get a real sense of this, southeast Welsh community, sort of coal mining community. You feel the sense of place and of the house and the dynamics between all the characters, purely visually. I mean, what he's able to do with his framing is outstanding. It really is just continually, over and over again, amazing frames and amazing images that just blow you away. And the movie is interesting in its novelistic approach, in which there's lots of different storylines within the movie. It's always keeping you on your toes, always keeping you engaged. That being said, I think they tried to fit everything in the book into the movie, and then we get certain strands that don't really go anywhere or feel a little bit unnecessary or don't add to the overall element of the story. That being said, the whole point of the movie is to look at this entire community through this family. There's many different members of the family and the priest, and how the town changes. That's the sort of main point of the movie, and it does so well at that. But it still does feel at times overstuffed, and not all the storylines go necessarily where you want to go, and because of that you're left a little bit lost or emotionally distant to some of the characters, which makes for a bit of a frustrating appearance, because you look at the movie and you go, this could have been an all-time classic, and it's just missing a couple things. It could be edited in a couple places, at least in my viewpoint. So Overall, a really beautifully looking movie, maybe the best John Ford looking movie, but a little bit overstuffed, but still good enough to be slotted in the B tier. Mrs. Miniver, 1942, a great World War II movie, and in many ways a self-admitted propaganda movie about the English family and their struggles and how the war sort of impacts their family. And the movie really has got everything. It's got the romance between Mr. and Mrs. Miniver, which can also play like a modern-day romantic comedy in many ways. You also have the actual romance of Vin, the older brother of the family, and then Teresa Wright's character, Carol, who's really so terrific in this movie and a lot of William Wyler's movies. And so you have the romance there that adds to there. We have the comedy from Mr. and Mrs. Miniver. Then you also have the drama and the tension when the German pilot lands into the backyard and has that sort of confrontation, or even just the fact of Vin going off to become a pilot and that sort of tension within the family. You see all the different aspects of war, but also as a movie, you get all these different genres almost within it, of a romance, of a comedy, of a serious drama. And that's what William Wyler is so great at. I think William Wyler is one of those filmmakers, at least in my opinion, that has been underrated. I've covered him on this channel before, but I put him up there with John Ford, with Martin Scorsese, with Steven Spielberg. I think he's Orson Welles. I think he's one of the all-time greats. Although I don't think a lot of people see him that way. But when you look at his movies, it's obvious, it's clear. And what he's best at is the capital D human drama. That sort of capturing all these different genres within them that tells these people's lives so well. And it's Mrs. Miniver is the title of the movie, but it really is about this entire family and the interactions between them. So it is openly a propaganda type film to encourage Americans to support the war and get into the war. That being said, I think it's still a really well-made movie. It's still great at doing that. It's effective at stirring up those emotions because Will Wyler is so understanding of what's needed to create those emotions, to create those feelings of passion and of patriotism. And he does so not through this big bombastic American war movie, but looking at it through the sacrifices and the intimacies of what seems like a regular family, an ordinary British family, and the heroism that they have within the war. So it's a fascinating approach to that, but really successful because of how talented of a filmmaker Wyler is. So a great everyday human drama, something that only William Wyler could achieve, is going to go into the A tier. Casablanca, 1943. I mean, what is there to say? This is an all-time classic movie, and I mentioned it last week. Movies like Casablanca or 12 Angry Men or All About Eve, they are these classic kind of black and white movies that I recommend to a lot of people when starting out with older movies, just because they feel so modern. And I think there's been so much said about Casablanca that we won't go too in depth of this, but what I've always appreciated about the movie is its sense of place and its sense of history. That certain movies, they want to explain everything to you, and they want to treat the audience as sort of dumb, and there's too much exposition, and those aren't great. But then there's certain movies that are so obtuse that they don't want to tell you anything, and they think that makes it more interesting because they're so difficult to read. But they're intentionally obtuse, and that makes them just frustrating. But Casablanca is a perfect sort of mix, where you're jumped into this story, and these people seem like real people because they've had lives before. There's a relationship between Rick and Elsa, but you don't exactly know what until later on in the movie. You see Rick's bar as this place with actual history and people who know each other and the relationships. You just feel like as a viewer, you've been thrown into the story of people who are already having these existing lives. At the way we're able to understand story beats, but not until later, to trust the audience that we'll figure out the relationships eventually, that will be revealed to us. But at the beginning, you really don't know who these people are, what do they do, what the relationship is to the war. And because of that, they immediately feel like real people, that they're not people and characters designed from nothing, written on a paper to exist just as movie characters, but real people that are living their lives that we can tell a story about. And what that does, it just allows us to eventually emotionally connect to the story, to the tragedy, to the heartbreak of it all, but also to the sort of hopefulness of the story that I think is so prevalent because of that sort of smart decision just to have these pre-existing relationships, these pre-existing characters, and to sort of throw us into the middle of the story rather than, a birth to grave sort of a situation. And I think that's almost the secret sauce of Casablanca that doesn't always get talked about, but is probably my favorite part of the movie. So obviously, Casablanca, S tier movie. 1944, Going My Way. One of the big surprises for me When doing this series, because I had seen this movie before, this was a first-time watch, and I was surprised at just how prescient the movie is. You know, despite being 80 years old at this point, it feels very relevant to today. About a priest, at least in the first half, who was introduced to this new community, this new parish, and he's trying to juggle how he's able to integrate himself within the community with their pre-existing relationships. Where does God fit into everyday life? A lot of those sort of thematic religious questions are brought up in the beginning, and I think prescient because as religion becomes less and less a part of Western society, it seems like there is more of a challenge for modern day priests to sort of implement themselves within the community, within the sort of the faith-based community of today. And to see that story, at least in the first half, engage with those questions and those bigger ideas was sort of really fascinating, and just from a modern day perspective, because I think you can see the parallels. And then, you know, this is not a super heavy movie at the end of the day. This is still a Bing Crosby kind of a movie where there's singing and there is joyousness. And I think a large reason why the success, particularly the second half, where we get Bing Crosby's character as a priest teaching the boys about music and choir, and he's able to connect to the community in that way. We get a lot of just joyous, fun moments, and Bing Crosby is the sort of ultimate charismatic, seems like a safe, nice, genuine kind of a person. He exudes that persona, almost like a modern-day Tom Hanks in that way. And his real skill is in just being able to work a room into always being the smartest guy and being one step ahead of everyone, not in a cutting kind of way, but in I know more than maybe I'm letting on, but I'm being gentle and nice about it to help you realize it on your own. Kind of a smart, empathetic way of maneuvering conversations that Bing Crosby's so able to exude, and you really haven't seen. It's a rare talent of, you know, think of him or like a Tom Hanks. Now, the film, I think, maybe stops itself from going into the top tier of movies just because it drops some of those earlier on themes in favor of just being more of a traditional story. Now, that story is really joyous and delightful, and the first half really does engage with those themes, so I do appreciate that. And it was a really big surprise for me, so a nice, enjoyable movie that flirts, I think, with a lot of those compelling ideas that feel still relevant to today. So it's going to go into the A tier. The Lost Weekend, Billy Wilder's first Best Picture winner. We covered The Apartment in the 1960s video, but this was his first Best Picture winner. And weird to think, though, because it's still not one of his top 3 movies, but still a super solid drama. Kind of a hard one to watch just because it's about this man who tries to quit alcohol and then sort of fails and then eventually devolves into this drunken stupor. And it feels kind of like a one-man play-esque kind of a story. And it's a great performance by Ray Milland, and you know, it's still an entertaining and enjoyable movie today. It's just a really sort of tough, serious, weighty kind of movie that's not one you throw on all the time, and it's still hard to feel super passionate about. But as a story, it works very well. It hits all those beats. Great performance at the center, and works overall. So for me, a solid movie that's going to go into the B tier. Then 1946, The Best Years of Our Lives, another William Wyler Best Picture winner, 2 in this decade, just to show how dominant he really was. And was throughout his entire career. He was very well celebrated during his career, but you know, for some reason has been less so in modern day times. And you know, it's crazy just as a historical document that this movie exists, because you get the director who does Mrs. Miniver, which is this propaganda film to get people into the war, and then a year after the war ends, you get this movie, which is incredibly prescient at the time. It's still prescient movie today about the impacts of the war, about the fact that yes, you guys went to war and sacrificed because it was this great cause, Mrs. Miniver, but also, as soon as the war is done, Wyler's next movie is, let's talk about the impacts of the war. This wasn't all clean and dandy. And Wyler went to war. He actually was in World War II doing a lot of filming, so he knew that this topic right away and firsthand. And the story tells the story of these 3 men who were coming back from World War II, trying to reintegrate into their civilian lives, dealing with the trauma from the war. But then also we get to see sort of 3 different social classes, which didn't directly align with their classes within the platoon, within war. So we have a little bit of conflict from there. So just as a historical document, the fact that this movie exists, the fact that the guy who made a propaganda movie is also making a movie that's incredibly realistic and confronting these topics of PTSD all the way back in the 1940s, incredibly prescient movie. And the fact that he just made it a year after the war, that it was resonating with people and men as as they were going through it. It wasn't a movie that was made in the 50s and we were able to look back on it. No, it was made during the time. It was incredibly prescient. So just the fact that this exists is a fascinating idea. But then the movie itself is also genius. It's also a great movie because you have a dedication to realism. I think that's what Wyler is so able to understand within this movie. Every little decision he's able to do is for realism. Now, realism doesn't always necessarily mean great. I mean, you can have a realistic superhero movie in Man of Steel, or the Suicide Squad was realistic and gritty, but it didn't necessarily hold together. It was a little bit messy. You know, I'm talking about the 2016 Suicide Squad and sort of that era of DC. But this movie is realistic, and it's great because realism therefore translates to honesty. So realism in the sense of you get a real non-actor portray, a real World War II veteran non-actor portray one of the main characters. You get deep focused cinematography from Greg Toland, which I think mimics a lot of times the human eye, in which you can see things in clarity. There's not sort of intense subjective, depth of field and lack of focus. You can really see everything going on at once, and that adds to the realism as well. And then because it's so realistic, it feels so honest as well. There's a correlation there. So the emotions feel honest. These guys feel like real people. You understand their plights. Even though I'm not a World War II veteran, I feel like I am one. I understand their emotions so clearly. And I think that this is a realistic movie also in the sense of it's not overly optimistic. It's not saying, oh, the 50s, the decade's going to be great, the baby boomers. It's being honest with itself and being, hey, these guys went through this incredibly traumatic event. This trauma will never leave them. It will stay with them for the rest of their life. There is still hope that they can, deal with it and live with it and still live productive lives. But that's not going away. And it's realistic in that sense. It's not pessimistic, but it is realistic in its approach that this is a significant effect that affects these men, and they're going to have to live with that. And to tell one great story is incredible, but to tell three great individual stories and the connection between the men and their lives and how they unfold is just one of the great dramas of all time, and a criminally still under-discussed movie, in my opinion. William Wyler is a genius for this movie alone, so without a doubt an S-tier movie. Gentleman's Agreement, 1947, about a movie in which the Americans tackle anti-Semitism. They were just fighting a war in World War II in which they were fighting against anti-Semitism, and then this movie sort of looks back at the Americans and holds a mirror up to themselves and say, we were just fighting guys that were doing horrible, incredible Holocaust and horrible things to Jews, and yet we still have anti-Semitic views of ourselves in terms of hiring practices, in terms of country clubs and whatnot. And this movie tells a story about a journalist who pretends to be Jewish. And essentially it's an important movie that knows it's important, and that's the struggle I had with it ultimately. That this feels like a movie in which a YouTuber gives money to a homeless person and films it and has to interview the homeless person and whatnot. The act itself is fine and it is noble, giving the money to a homeless person, helping someone in need. Yet when you see a YouTuber do that, it feels a little bit exploitative. And this is the movie equivalent of that, in my opinion. It's these big speeches. It's this sort of social justice warrior in Gregory Peck telling everyone how they should be and yelling at them and confronting them and having those uncomfortable conversations. But it's smug in its way that it knows what it's doing. It's trying to be so important and saying, we're the good guys, we're going to do this great thing. But it doesn't actually engage with the actual topic itself or have an empathy towards it, because its character is the non-Jew. Its main character is someone who's trying to relate but can't ultimately, but still sort of fights for them and fights for that cause. It's something that wouldn't probably be done in modern days. And just from the fact that it's a movie that's self-aware, that it's an important movie, feels kind of gross and exploitative. So it really sort of rubbed me the wrong way and got old fast. So for me, it's going to have to be put into the D tier. Unfortunately, just not for me. Hamlet, 1948. We'll be quick with this one. This is a definitive Hamlet adaptation. Undoubtedly, Olivier is terrific in his portrayal as Hamlet. Just that to be or not to be speech. It is terrific, and the movie is undoubtedly cinematic. But personally for me, I've never been a huge Shakespeare fan. I've never been able to totally emotionally get into the story and into the plays, and I've never really totally enjoyed a Shakespeare adaptation. So I can recognize that this is a good one. I can recognize that the cinematography is great and it actually does feel cinematic and not like a play, and I recognize that Olivier is doing a great job. That being said, I just have struggles emotionally connecting with the movie, so it's a classic example of the movie I respect, even though I don't really love or like. So it's going to go in the middle tier, the B tier for me. Then, 1949, All the King's Men. It's amazing just how many of these movies from the 40s are so relevant and prescient to today, when the 50s were a decade that was full of these sort of lavish, escapist types of movies that didn't feel relevant at all. Even into the 60s, we had a lot of those too. But the 40s were so relevant and so prescient and felt sort of socially charged in that regard. And this movie is a incredibly nihilistic viewpoint of politics, about an everyday man who runs for his local treasury and then doesn't win, and then eventually tries to go for senator or governor, and then doesn't win, and then tries again, and then does win. And essentially the story about an everyday man who runs to stop the corrupt politicians, but then in pursuit of running becomes so obsessed with winning, becomes corrupt himself, and the sort of evolution of this man from everyday noble person just to how the political machine manipulates him and takes him down and makes him into this sort of figure that we can't even recognize from the end to the beginning of the movie. And Broderick Crawford is so terrific at playing both this sort of almost gullible, regular, everyday man to the conniving political governor at the end of the movie. To create that transformation is clear. And you know where the story is going. It's not a spoiler to say that's what happens. You know that this is this type of a movie. But it's still entertaining to see how it evolves, the relationships, how they change, how he devalues all the stuff he said at the beginning, and just seeing the journalists sort of document that process. It's a fascinating movie and a very relevant movie today, which makes sense why Sean Penn remade it in 2006, although it's still a movie I think that plays today and is entertaining. It's not like a movie with a bad idea, or it's not a movie with a good idea that was executed poorly. It was still executed really entertainingly. But I can see why someone would want to remake it today. I haven't seen the Sean Penn one, so maybe that will be on my list. But so a great movie that I think could be applied to modern day politics. So it's an A tier movie for me. But that's about it, guys. Take a look at the list. Not any movies in the C tier interesting. You know, a lot of them were solid Bs, up into some of the S's, which I really enjoyed. Of course, Casablanca and Best Years of Our Lives, two classic movies in my opinion. So glad that they won Best Picture. And then Gentleman's Agreement, really the only one that I didn't really totally enjoy. But let me know your thoughts, compare it to my list, let me know your rankings in the comments down below, and stay tuned. Next week is going to be the Best Actor tier for the 2010s, so yet the talking about Leonardo DiCaprio and Matthew McConaughey, and then Colin Firth, and you know, there's lots of interesting what-if scenarios and interesting modern movies that'll be a lot of fun to talk about. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, stay tuned.